In the previous lecture, you saw that the URL didn't look all that pretty because it included a hashtag. Fortunately, we can change that if we want by simply passing an option to the router. The option is named mode, and this refers to how the router matches routes, or rather, which strategy it uses for this. There are a few things to be aware of when choosing an appropriate mode, but I'll get back to that after showing you how to change the mode. There are two modes that we can choose between, history and hash, with the latter being the default mode that we saw in the previous lecture. So needless to say, I'll be switching to the history mode. So let's go to the main.js file and find the router. All I need to do to change the mode is add a new property named mode, like I mentioned, and set it to history. The history mode utilizes the HTML5 push date API to keep track of the history, so therefore browser compatibility may be something to keep in mind, depending on your target audience. Okay, so what does this history mode actually look like in terms of the URLs? Well, it uses the part after the domain name to match the route, and this means a goodbye to the hashtag fragment. Let me just go ahead and show it to you. So let's just remove what's in the URL already from the previous render. So for the initial page, we can see that the URL no longer contains a slash followed by a hashtag and another slash, which looked kind of messy. With the history mode, I can now navigate to the cart page by simply appending /cart to the URL. Now that looks much cleaner, doesn't it? Okay, so now that you've seen how to change the mode and what it looks like, let's talk a little bit about some backend requirements. When using the history mode, you need to configure your backend to always return the SPA template, which in this case is the index.html file. This would always happen in the case of using the hash strategy, because that fragment was only used by the browser. With the history mode, however, the route path is now passed by the backend. If you're just using a web server for only serving static content and have no backend code, then you can quite easily configure a web server to handle this. More commonly though, you will have a backend that runs some code, connects to a database, etc. In that case, you will need to configure your backend to always serve the HTML markup that loads up Vue.js, so the markup that contains the Webpack bundle. If you do have some backend code, then you need to make sure that it responds with this HTML markup. If you're using a framework, then you can either add a wildcard route that returns this markup, or even better, add a route for each page. The problem with a wildcard route is that your web server will then return a 200 OK HTTP status code, which is a signal to search engines that the given page exists, even though it may not be a valid endpoint. So if you want to optimize that part of it, make sure to only add routes for pages that you want people to access. Now there are endless of ways that your backend can be set up, so it's impossible for me to provide instructions for all of them. The important thing is that your backend needs to respond with the HTML markup that initializes Vue.js, regardless of whether or not you're just using a web server or if you have some backend code running. You should be able to find instructions for pretty much any setup out there by searching on Google, but if you face any issues, then you're of course welcome to ask. So the way it works is that the server responds with the HTML markup that initializes Vue.js. Once Vue has been bootstrapped, it passes the URL path to match the appropriate route, which is then rendered in the place of the router Vue tag. Using the history mode may require you to configure whichever backend you're using a bit, but this should usually be a fairly simple task. The bonus is that your URLs will look much nicer and more modern as well. That being said, the history mode will work out of the box for projects that have been created using the Webpack simple template, because the development web server that's included within the template is configured to always return the index.html file. If this were not the case, then it wouldn't work. Since I personally prefer the history mode, and you will probably agree with me, that is the mode that I will use for the remainder of this course. Alright, so that's how easy it is to change the router mode.